All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Dan Manley, and I'm the interim chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture here at the University of Florida. And on behalf of the department, it's my privilege to welcome you to the 2021 Edward D. Stone Jr. Lecture Series. Although we cannot be face-to-face for this event, I'm excited that we had over 140 RSVPs for tonight's lecture, which is great news. This lecture series was started in remembrance of Edward D. Stone Jr., a beloved colleague, mentor, partner, advisor, and friend to so many. I want to thank the Friends of Edward D. Stone Jr. for making it possible for the department to host this lecture in his honor and commemorate his numerous contributions to the fields of landscape architecture and land planning. We are recording this presentation so that it can be shared on our website with the other lecture series presentations. As I put in the chat earlier, we will also have a time at the end for questions, and we'll be using the chat for questions. So I would ask that if you have a question, please put it in the chat, and I would also ask that we please reserve the chat for questions only. And with that, this year I'm honored to introduce our speaker and Gator alum, Walter Meyer. Walter Rodriguez Meyer is a landscape and urban designer, educator, and community organizer for climate justice. He is co-founder of Local Office Landscape and Urban Design based in Brooklyn, New York. The firm has garnered accolades from across the disciplines of architecture, landscape architecture, public policy, science, and art. Walter teaches at Parsons, the New School for Design, and holds a BLA from the University of Florida, go Gators, and MLA UD at Harvard Graduate School of Design. Walter is also the executive director of the nonprofit Coastal Marine Resource Center. Walter's cultural collaborations include artists 𝘼𝙗𝙗𝙩𝙪𝙧𝙚, Agnes Dennis, Michelle Okadonner, Justin Bryce Guariglia, Rosie Perez, and Kara Walker. At a time when climate resilience projects are being planned and constructed, Walter's built works at the scale of the neighborhood, city, and bioregion are some of the few examples that have withstood the planet's most severe forces. The performance metrics from his built projects have shaped local and national policy. President Obama named Walter a White House champion of change. The New York Times and the New Yorker documented how Lola's redesign of the soggy Miracle Mile district in Miami protected small business owners, absorbing the heaviest floods ever measured during Hurricane Irma. Shops opened the next business day while the rest of the city took months to recover. Architectural Record documented how 30 businesses were protected from Hurricane Maria by the 2-kilometer Parque Littoral in Puerto Rico, where Lola converted an industrial shore into dunes, wetlands, and an urban forest. Walter's landscape-led city-making approach is currently being implemented in state resiliency plans for New Jersey and Mississippi, and he is designing New York City's first climate-proof, fossil fuel-free neighborhood named Arvin East in Rockaway Beach. Join me in welcoming Walter Rodriguez Meyer.
Thank you, Dan. It's been a couple decades since I've been able to enjoy the campus there. A few years back, Tina Gurachari, who is in your chair position previously, had me come back for an alumni award, and it was exciting to see how much the campus has evolved. A lot of people don't realize how special the program is in Florida, both geographically and intellectually. It's in some ways like a tropical Bauhaus, the way the curriculum was organized when I was there. When I was in the program, it was one of the few programs in the country where all the disciplines, where landscape architecture, interior design, were all in 4 semesters together, studying under the big umbrella of design. So 2 years together before we separated into our disciplines. Not only did that build camaraderie, but it really integrated design thinking through the aesthetics, through formalism and representation. And then we broke off into our disciplines and developed a technical capacity. And that's rare. And I learned, going up to the GSD for graduate school at Harvard, that they're not even as seamlessly integrated as my experience at University of Florida was. So I encourage and I hope that the dean, as he's starting to kind of mold these programs for the next generation, can get back to that original spirit of the program that made it so unique, is that vertically integrated thinking about design in the built environment. Geographically, Florida is an important place to study if you're interested in resiliency. Why? Because some of the most intense wind forces as well as the most intense wave and water forces on the planet occur in cities in the tropical belt. So places like Miami, Gainesville, the Gulf Coast, these regions, really are, rain is measured in, inches per hour that are triple that of what we get here in New York City, where I live now. A rain event of an inch or two an hour would flood the subways, cause $1 billion of damage. But an inch or two rain event in an hour is a typical summer event in Miami, right? So I think it's important to note that being educated here and having your projects work here prepare you for working at climate change and with extreme forces anywhere else on the planet. So I think that's important to note. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So I'm going to start with really a little bit of the curriculum that we teach at the Masters of Architecture program in Urban Design in Parsons. And I apologize for some if this is rudimentary. I want to start with the basics of, going back to where resiliency came from as a thought model and the premise that led to it. And really it's about this model of nature, and our understanding of nature has evolved over time, mostly because of knowledge and science that's evolved. But the very first, ecologist to use the term was Frederick Clements. And on the top of this slide is one of his drawings. And it was a static model of nature. It was kind of a snapshot where the way he explained how nature worked was looking at a successionary forest in the Northeast. And so Frederick Clements, and this is a turn of the last century, going his kind of career peaked in the Great Depression era. So Frederick Clements talked about this three-dimensional model where it starts on the left with a bare field, evolves into a grassland, and then eventually gets supplanted by grass shrubs, a pine forest, and eventually climaxes as this oak hickory forest. And the story is it kind of ends there, and when nature is untouched or not disturbed, it starts to evolve. And then, a generation or generations later came post-World War II thought and technology around ecology. And modern ecology today was established by the late professor and former UF professor, 𝘼𝙗𝙠𝙪𝙩, who worked with his wife and his family on this. It was kind of a family affair on establishing the modern thinking around ecology. And they did not throw out Frederick Clements' work from the generation before. They simply said he was accurate, but it was only a snapshot of how nature actually worked. And so if you look at that slide at the bottom, that was pulled out of one of 𝘼𝙗𝙠𝙪𝙩's books on really an abstraction of nature that wasn't spatial, it was relational. So to explain this, if you look at the slide at the bottom, you'll see a resource reserve line, and then you'll see a population, right? And you can plug any element that's man-made or natural into this. But to follow an example here, when you have a resource, let's say like a wheat field that a farmer plants, and that wheat field grows over the season. And when it's time for harvest, it coincides with a parasite, let's say a locust outbreak. And so that spike that you see there in the graph would be a parasite, emerging. And it would eat all the wheat, and then it crashes the entire system, and then all of it collapses. And then next season it reboots. And so that parasitic relationship between a reserve and a population can be plugged into a man-made event as well. And so to give an example of a man-made event, you can look at the 2008 financial crisis, which was a healthy housing market growing. And then you start to get predatory lending. The parasite in this case was unsecured debt. and over leverage situations. And so that instead of the locus, it's the the over leverage investors who are coming in and buying default swaps or buying mortgages, that are detached from their risk, and that crashed what was a healthy housing market. And so you can describe the housing market, you can describe a wheat field, you can describe a forest, all in the same way. And it kind of added a layer of thought, which shifted our understanding of nature, in that, sustainability was born out of the Clements model, and resiliency was born out of the Odum model, is how I see this in how we practice. And the Odum model simply is that we are inseparable from nature. Why? Because if you can plug in man-made systems into this and describe it equally as you can natural systems, we're just permitted to be a part of this planet, and the way that oxygen and carbon exchange through plants, us humans are permitted to participate in that if we wish to, right? And we're inseparable from that. And because of, in the Industrial Revolution, we misled ourselves as humans that we can conquer nature, because in the regional frame that we understood the world, not the planetary frame at that time, but at the Industrial Revolution, 1800s into early 1900s, we were able to see the region and say, yeah, we can conquer nature. But we didn't realize we can only conquer the region. But when you fast forward to World War II and the frame change, we can see, we have satellites, we can sense things in real time after World War II and into the Cold War. And we start to realize we are truly inseparable from nature. We're a part of a larger system, and we need to start governing ourselves in that manner. And so a lot of our laws are written based on the old model, the static model. And so the challenges for resiliency are that some of these proposals are illegal to build on the books. They're illegal against Title IV wetland laws, some of the things that we want to do. So how do we find loopholes or change the policies so that our laws, which take about 40 to 50 years to migrate from academia to mainstream policy, how do we start to accelerate that effect on the policy so that we can start to design things that are in line with nature? And that shifting model of nature, from the static to the dynamic, from the 3D to the 4D, the four-dimensional, meaning time, started to affect culture in so many ways, including in the ethical sea. Almost every religious aspect was influenced by this, including the Jewish environment and energy imperative to Pope Francis encyclical on climate change, even the Islamic Declaration on climate change, saying that it's man-induced, man-made. And so, and the other piece of this is the four-dimensional aspect is time, and the way this graphic is stacked is looking from the bottom up, geology operating in billions of years, topography in millions of years, hydrology shaped over hundreds of thousands of years, soil types over thousands of years, habitats, over hundreds of years, and then fauna measured in decades. And that kind of time compression, as we intervene on projects, we kind of eventually affect or are affected by all those time cycles, from the billions of years to the decadal, the fauna, the animals. And a lot of this shaping, when I was in grad school, there wasn't a lot of projects that we can point to that were built that supported resilience thinking. There were plenty of sustainability projects that had been coming online for 30 years, but there wasn't enough built resiliency work. And at the time, resiliency was being influenced in academia by the space in Europe, which is the psychosocial space around resiliency, as well as the American ecological space came together in academia. But there wasn't any built projects. And some of the projects that we tried to do on the books were hard to get built from a regulatory perspective. But one of the things I sought out to do as a practitioner after the GSD was to try to build as much as I could in the resiliency space so that we can see how it performs collect the metrics from these disturbances and being able to share those metrics with the world to help shape policy. And these metrics are what I call the metrics of imperfection. They're how these projects are not 100% resilient, but they're rather close. And so some of the projects I'll show you are Parque Littoral in Puerto Rico as an example of one of our oldest projects. It's been hit by several storm events, even earthquakes. And back in 2008, my congresswoman, Nydia Velázquez, Nydia Velázquez is from New York, but born in Puerto Rico. And she was very proud of that Parque Littoral Mayaguez and asked me to present it to Congress. So she, at the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, just as Obama, in his first administration starts to get in office, presents Parque Littoral Mayaguez, and it kind of set a stage for me to be able to advise the federal government on policy papers that can allow policy to get out of the way of resilience thinking, and in general, what is landscape thinking. So I started to advise and become an author to the White House and shape some of their policies. This is a snapshot from the Obama White House website. And that was that was 2006, 2007, 2008. And what happened over time is some disturbances started to happen, right? We just finished with the Katrina recovery in the Gulf Coast, and then Hurricane Sandy came barging into our backyard in Brooklyn, New York, and Rockaway is out there, and Queens, and really changed the way cities respond to climate change. That Hurricane Sandy wasn't just a storm, it was a massive amount of data for humanity to process, a lot of information about we need to build our cities differently. And we started to advise the federal government through the Hurricane Sandy Task Force in 2013 on the projects that we built that aren't perfect, but they can shape shovel-ready projects moving forward in New York City. And several projects spun out of this thinking, working with the Chief Resiliency Officer of New York City, Dan Zarilli, on establishing something called the 𝘚 report. It was a report that helped define how to spend nearly $60 billion in the region, along with a bunch of other brilliant consultants working on this over time. And one of the pieces that we were seeing were problematic, and this is a 2015 white paper that I highly recommend that everyone reads. This was published by the Obama administration, led by some brilliant thinkers around ecosystem economics, Tamara Dickinson, Timothy Mayo, and 𝘼𝙗𝙩𝙪𝙩. So we're advisors and fed into this document. And it's really important because one of the drawbacks, or one of the hurdles to designing around natural infrastructure is that the Army Corps handbook has formulas that go back to the 1800s about how seawalls work, but the federal government isn't really well established on what are the metrics for natural infrastructure and how do we build parity economically between natural infrastructure and hard infrastructure. And this document starts to set the framework for requiring that agencies start to look at the benefit cost analysis model, both equally with natural infrastructure as well as the old gray infrastructure as well. And so what's great about working with all those executives in the government at that time is that some of them over time start to go into private practice. And the former commander of Army Corps of Engineers for New York District, named Colonel John Boulay, is a good friend, and he's now working at Dewberry as a leader there on coastal resiliency. And John and I teamed up for a design competition for the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and that's what this project is. It was our proposal was to convert where fresh and salt water interact on the Mississippi Gulf Coast in their cities and towns, to convert these what are called outfalls and to convert them into micro bayous, essentially bringing back at a small scale what might have existed 300 years ago. But in this case, not just for the sake of restoration or biodiversity, but also for protecting property around these projects. And so this project was led, we were a sub to a local prime who's a great architect named Allison Anderson, who's done a lot of work nationally as an architect in emergency response and FEMA projects that have survived hurricanes. In this proposal, it was funded by the Deepwater Horizon project. So Deepwater Horizon was a big oil spill, you may recall, a long time ago, and that billions of dollars in fines is starting to percolate through these communities. And this project was funded by that money. And I think it's important symbolically that, something, that was so catastrophic to the environment and to loss of life, as well as livelihoods for fishermen in the region, can start to have a net positive impact because of these successful finds and the way they're managed. But in this case, what we propose, we studied some of the barrier islands off of the state of Mississippi and really learned how the barrier islands have a freshwater lens. They collect rainwater that floats on top of salt, and that supports this woody vegetation of dune forest. And so we proposed these smaller islands, like you see in this slide, that would split wave energy and absorb a lot of that wave runup. And then the surge that comes after the wave, the change in water level with a hurricane, is buffered further by another layer of dune systems that are along the shore to protect. One of the most vulnerable points of this coast are where these creeks or outfalls connect, where fresh and saltwater interface. So we're taking the most vulnerable location and building out a multi-layered system to reduce insurance premium costs for those properties that you see in this slide. The last part of this is a sustainability layer, that the fresh water flowing out, the first flush of it, which is that, the first flush of nutrients that come with a rain event, are kept in the swales of the dunes. So the low-lying areas of the dunes are like a big absorption space. They hold in these wetlands all the nutrients, which are great for plants, but those nutrients hit the ocean or the Gulf, and they cause red tide and algae outbreaks and suck all the oxygen out of the water and cause a fish kill. So this is a sustainability system as well as a resiliency system. And this is some of the construction documents. This is now going through permitting with the Army Corps of Engineers Mobile District. Mobile, Alabama is the home base where the state of Mississippi's coastline is governed from for the federal government, along with Fish and Wildlife. And this is managed by MDEQ, that's the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality. This is a complex interagency project when you're dealing with the scale of a coast of an entire state. This next project is our design for Miracle Mile. This is in Coral Gables. It's a neighborhood within the city of Miami, or not within the city of Miami, it's its own city next to the city of Miami. But what most people know of Miami, Southeast Florida, Coral Gables is one of the more historic neighborhoods there. If you're from the West Coast, this would be like Rodeo Drive, for the Southeast Florida region. We collaborated with a great team, an engineering firm, Coastal Systems International, Rodriguez and Quiroga Architects, Cooper Robertson and Partners out of New York City, which Cooper Robertson is where after GSD, after Harvard, I worked there and became the director of sustainability for Cooper Robertson and worked on some large scale infrastructure projects and maintained a relationship with Jack Robertson, the late Jack Robertson and Alex Cooper, and we continue to collaborate on projects, including this one. And this one, Miracle Mile, started with an existing pipe that we were not going to touch. And you see that pipe in the bottom right corner, too expensive. We didn't have the budget to update civil infrastructure, but we wanted to prove how some of these bleeding edge, at the time, new green infrastructure can offset the need for building expensive pipes underground and spending that money on a singular investment that nobody will ever see. Well, instead, with the green infrastructure approach that is networked, that's interconnected, we can catch as much rainwater at the surface, and you can actually see it, and it has a multi-layered return that starts to have curb appeal impacts on the properties around it, as well as becomes an amenity that increases the quality of life. And what you may ask, what is NGI? What is network green infrastructure? It's different than a tree pit. Like most urban environments, we put a tree and it has a little lollipop of a root ball and it gets stuck and the wind blows and it knocks it over. And you spend millions of dollars recovering road beds after hurricanes knock trees down. What is network green infrastructure? If we see this construction site, we've excavated out the rock, the reef, that old ancient rock reef of Coral Gables that Miami is famous for, and brought in structural soils. And you see in the foreground Cornell University structural soil. That allows the entire road bed or the sidewalk bed to be a contiguous root layer. So it essentially, under the urban surface of the pavement, it operates as a contiguous network of forests in the way a forest may function 200 years ago, and that all the roots are interconnected, you have nutrient exchange. But most importantly, we're supercharging that forest. This forest can hold 2 or 3 times as much water as an untouched forest from hundreds of years ago, just because of this augmented soil condition. The pavers are porous, and the aesthetic decisions around the pavers are such that we're looking at porous paving joints, that the stone you see is a mix of some native stone with stone from South America, with Miami being the nexus between North and South America. We brought quartz from Brazil, and you see that blue sky up in the air there, Miami's famous clouds, you know, that poche of dark gray and light with the blue windows in the sky. That's mirrored on the ground and treated the stone so that when it's wet, it has a different aesthetic sheen than when it's dry. And so the embracing water as an aesthetic form. And in this other street that we worked on, Giralda Plaza, water is expressed as raindrops, you know, centered around each tree, and those tree roots, again, interconnected. And working with a local artist, so those concentric raindrop patterns are picked up in the water infrastructure as well, in the drainage systems. And this project was tested by Hurricane Irma. Irma hit this project in 1 month after it opened, and is one of the heaviest rains ever measured. And the businesses were able to reopen right after the storm, like the next business day. And some of the New Yorker magazine interviewed one of those businesses, and you can find it online if you Google Miracle Mile New Yorker. And they interviewed this business owner who had other businesses around the city, and she didn't have insurance coverage. But because the one shop here on Miracle Mile stayed open, the profits from that shop helped her rebuild her 6 other shops around the city, which took months to rebuild. So it's the story of how trees and small businesses interact. This is an economic imperative as much as it is an ecologic one. The next project is Parque Littoral in Mayaguez in Puerto Rico. This is the West Coast, 3rd largest city. This contract was with the governor of Puerto Rico at the time in 2006. This was designing essentially the entire watershed of the city. We didn't have enough data in GIS to determine how big the watershed was feeding into this, but we did have pipe sizes. And so we worked out a series of wetlands sized to the pipe outflow, peak flow, and we designed for that first flush so that we can capture the first, you know, half hour of flow inside of the wetlands, kind of like what I showed you in Mississippi that's being planned. This has been built and been tested by several storm events, by flash floods, as well as Hurricane Maria. Now pay attention to the upper right corner of this slide. You'll see a pipe that's up there, and that's an old stormwater pipe. This is the existing conditions that we found on site. It's a 2 kilometer long project. And with $55 million, that was not enough money to fix this problem using conventional methods of civil engineering. So what we looked at was what the EPA had guidelines for phytoremediation, which is EPA is a federal agency. We migrated that into the regional regulatory body, which is the Departamento de Recursos Naturales, or DRNA, really gave us space to experiment and take away a lot of the industrial shore that was there and convert it into a multi-layered phytoremediation bed, meaning the ability of plants to remove pollutants out of the water, the phytoremediation. And the way this works is, it's a cross section from the city to the sea, and we are extracting water as it moves through the reed beds. So we have a stone for sediment particle removal, secondary treatment through the roots of the plants, and then final polishing in the sand bed. And this project is held together by a coastal forest. Keep in mind, this was an industrial shore. There was nothing here before. Coming in and inserting wetlands, dunes, and this coastal forest to hold it together. All the surfaces were porous, and all of them, the program of the park being 2 kilometers long, responded its program to the adjacent urban design or the program of the existing neighborhoods. So in this case, this is overflow parking. You can tell it looks like a parking lot. You see the parking bumpers on the left and the right, but when there's no parking happening, it's a surface for a farmer's market. And it's next to a junior high and high school that they could establish a farmer's market and grow their food and sell it and connect the dots between the food system and the economic system. Another section of the park was near an elementary school. And so we toned down and tuned the open space to fit that program and programmed all of this kit of parts of recreation to support them. The other piece is the interplay between hard infrastructure and living infrastructure. There's never one binary choice. In fact, they're usually multi-layered. But if you look at that hard seawall behind here, it's a classic Army Corps seawall. The layers that you see in front are meant to protect that seawall and extend its life so that it never has to do what it's designed to do. It's there as your back line of defense, your last line of defense, and you want the wetlands and dunes and topography and trees to be your sacrificial layer. And that interplay between hard and living infrastructure is the answer for most cities. We even designed an amphitheater that's kind of a dunescape amphitheater that floods in high tides, easy to clean. After the hurricane, this 2 kilometer project was able to be restored with just the municipal budget of the city of Mayaguez. There wasn't a big federal investment required to clean the shore. Nature has a way of addressing these things in layers. The image on the left is a photo before the project was built. And you can see how this is dry conditions, the flow of the creeks and pipes leaching pollutants into the water. And the image on the right is, you can finally see the bay bottom after construction. So this is 3 years when the growing period is finished and all the roots are interconnected and the phytoremediated wetlands are flowing as performed and removing pollutants. In fact, you can see some of these wetlands, you can see there's layers of polishing happening in the water. As the water gets closer to the ocean, it's almost crystal clear. And some of these wetlands, as we get into there, you can see, remember that old pipe on the beach that I asked you to remember from a few slides back? This image on the right, you see that pipe in the bottom right corner? We cut that pipe upstream and then set up a series of oyster beds and black mangroves that can absorb the runoff from that stormwater. And these black mangrove and this salt grass you see here, this whole habitat can treat 6 gallons per hour per cubic foot of habitat. And so from that multiplier, we're able to size to that pipe size and design for the peak flow first flush volume. And that's what you're seeing here in this project. We also have bat houses. We have plant species that attract dragonflies, and they inoculate beneficial bacteria in the water, all to fight mosquitoes, and have a native minnow that eats mosquito larvae. So when you're in this area, you would think it's a concern for mosquito-borne viruses, but this is a healthy wetland, and there's hardly any mosquitoes as you walk through here. There's more mosquitoes in other parts of the city than there are in this wetland. And so it dispels all concerns about wetlands in the urban environment with regards to mosquitoes. This is a photograph after Maria. So, nearly a Cat 5 storm, a Cat 4 plus, came ashore, the heaviest surge ever measured, the heaviest rain event ever measured. And architectural record documented a few of the businesses in the area who were able to open the next week after. And some businesses adjacent to this project had an Army Corps seawall, a conventional seawall, and it took them 6 months to rebuild with a federal investment. And here it took a few weeks with a municipal investment. Also notice the sacrificial layers to the park, collapsed in the storm, but the core elements of the park held together. So the wood railing you see on the left fell apart. The wetlands flowed as designed all through the event and continue today. And we learned from the businesses that the mountains became rivers. The mountain roads that come down to the beach became rivers when the rain event, the flash flood happened. And all that water, instead of going to the businesses as it used to after this park, it all flowed to the wetland. And so the wetlands served a resiliency measure during the storm event that's in addition to their program of sustainability and polishing water when there are no storm events. Now, this project also wasn't perfect. It was what we call 91% resilient. The coastal forest lost 9% of its coverage. There was minor damaging to the railing and lighting. No loss of the bones of the project held together. And it took 2 weeks to rebuild. And the city has a jazz festival that they do there every year. And their grand reopening of the park brought the whole city in for this big concert and without much investment to recover. And noting that 6 gallon per hour per cubic foot of habitat, that maintained its capacity throughout the storm. So it's polishing water even during the storm event. This next project is in New York City. So Lola, for the past 7 years, my firm's been designing New York City's first fossil fuel-free neighborhood. So it's getting all of its energy from primarily solar and battery systems and geothermal heating and cooling. So Rockaway Beach in this slide is for you folks in Florida, this is like Miami Beach, right? It's a sand barrier island, and where Miami Beach has Biscayne Bay, New York City has Jamaica Bay. And then like downtown Miami, there's Manhattan off to the left. So it's that similar relationship in New York City. And the New York Times wrote about this project as being, building on the front line of climate change in New York. And the author, Stefanos Chen, wrote how the Green New Deal in New York City is being shaped by this project. And the project starts with thinking about, this hemisphere, and I think going back 12,000 years and 24,000 years, and when the ice sheets came and went, right? And that image on the left shows the United States and the extent of the Laurentide ice sheet. And then the image on the right shows the Wisconsin glacier that came down from Wisconsin and down to New York. And it stopped right in the middle of Long Island, Brooklyn, Staten Island that you see here. So everything south of that line has a whole other way of engaging with nature when you build in this city than everywhere north of the line. And it affects decisions like heating and cooling. And so in this image, you see that line, that glacial till line, that brown color. It's that glacial ridge. And this is cutting through Brooklyn that you see here. And just to the south of that line, you see Jamaica Bay. And the very end is Rockaway. And everything you see in this reddish color is what we call geothermal country. It means it's very low cost to drop some wells in and tap the groundwater for heating and cooling. It's one of the most renewable things you can do, even before doing solar. Why? Because it shrinks your energy footprint and you don't have to spend money on expensive solar panels. And so this project called Arvernice set out to establish a decentralized infrastructure approach to city making, which is the energy, stormwater management, all the systems of the city to be primarily decentralized. And it will be supplemented by the grid as needed, but and if we figured out, if you can make it work in New York City, in this intense urban environment, this is scalable to anywhere in the world. One of the big decentralized moves was to create a network of parks that could manage stormwater. Keep in mind that rainwater is intensifying by 10% per decade because of climate change. It's getting hotter air, and so we're getting these rain bombs, rains that are coming out of nowhere, some of the highest ever measured. And the only way to manage that is not with gray infrastructure. Why? Because civil engineering and gray infrastructure gets you 10-year storm event performance. But this natural infrastructure starts at about 100-year storm events, way off the charts of what cities expect you to design for. And so we're getting 100-year storm protection, even 1,000-year on some of our modeling. It depends on parts of the project and what they can, how much absorption area. In 3 dimensions, we're taking the end of the subway line out here in Rockaway, the A train. It connects you to Times Square. So imagine going on Times Square, doors open and close. You ride the subway, it opens up and you're on the beach. And it's literally the only place in the world that you can ride a subway to an ocean beach like this. And so we're trying to connect the subway with a main street, kind of restaurant road that gets you to the boardwalk with a new hotel and a manufacturing district that'll create wintertime jobs. As you know, in a seasonal place like Florida, wintertime jobs are important because these beach towns get these spikes in the summer. And so we have a brewery on the beach that will manufacture all kinds of local beer, as well as perhaps even roast coffee and other things. And this project is the mixed use buildings are 100% affordable. And then we have a series of bungalows and townhouses that are entry level market rate. All the buildings, so I'm educated the BLA, Bachelor of Landscape Architecture, and then my master's is in urban design. And largely what it is systems thinking. And how does that unfold, not just into the landscape, but in the way we build our cities. So what our firm does is, from a planning level, design the systems of the building and the systems of the site as one unified organism that manages water from the atmosphere and the clouds down to the groundwater. And so if you look here, you'll see solar on the roof. Our firm is planning all the solar systems for these projects. We work with the geothermal engineers to plan out the wells and time those, and then designing the water systems using rain gardens and bioswales. So all this resiliency in one big tent kind of creates landscape thinking for how you shape a building. Normally these systems are designed by an engineer and are not beautiful, they're just functional, but it's important to also have an aesthetic conversation about building systems. It's an elegant way of solving the resiliency challenges that we have. This is the part, some of the buildings are coming online for this neighborhood, and you can see they're passive house buildings, meaning they're super insulated. They get the majority of their energy from the sun. And these are 8-story buildings, and to get the majority of your energy from the sun on an 8-story building is not an easy task. You have solar everywhere, including the parking lots, solar trellises, and this is porous paving asphalt. So when the groundwater rises up at high tide or drops down, it doesn't cause the asphalt to crack. Most of the landscape is edible. The native dune landscapes of the Northeast have a high percentage of edibles. And for us, that's really important in affordable housing context in a place that is a food desert to have nutrients that you can't get at the store. There's also an integrated dune system as a part of this project. It's an urban dune system that was informed by Parque Littoral Mayaguez, but now hitting ground here in New York. Phases of it have been built and we're scaling up as we speak. This one project had one of the largest batteries ever built in New York City at the time, and it's able to run these buildings off grid for hours at a time. And solar everywhere, as I said. And so you may ask, how did a landscape architect get in the solar business? Well, energy landscape it's just landscape thinking. And it's something that the energy field can use. It's some landscape thinking. How do the systems overlap? And that leads to this type of project. This is downtown San Juan, Puerto Rico, right? This is 𝘼𝙗𝙩𝙪𝙪. So I had a client who moved to Puerto Rico, he bought this 3 blocks of San Juan and asked us to do a resiliency plan for it. This project was started with this solar, it's a massive 0.5 megawatt solar array that we designed for Cat 5 storms. And how in the urban environment, you have to model wind that has torsional loads, because when a hurricane hits the urban environment, it's not laminar flow. It starts to lift things in funky ways. And if you notice in the project, there are these kind of gills in the solar arrays that allow it to relieve pressure, but also allow light and air to come through for day-to-day stuff. And then lastly, it's designed for earthquakes as well. But this photograph you see here looks like a mess because this is after Hurricane Maria hit downtown San Juan. Now note that 30% of the solar systems in San Juan and all over Puerto Rico were impacted, by the hurricane. So that if you had a solar system, about a third of the solar panels were lost to the wind events. And most of that was projectiles as well as wind lift. But one of the things we looked at was what caused, we had very little failure. Instead of 30%, we were in the single digits. So we had very little failure despite having this direct hit. And one of the things we looked at was a post-mortem and went through with an engineer that helped build the project to understand what failed and why, and how can we improve these solar systems as we move forward. And here's the metrics of imperfection from that project. The array was 92% intact. 2% of the solar modules flew off from those bolts shearing that I showed in that image. The 6% of the modules were lost to projectiles. And the lesson learned is, we did a lot of innovative things here. For example, we eliminated racking on solar and we bolted the panels directly to the structure. But one of the things we will spec in the future is a heavier bolt, because what happened is we didn't account for human error, that if somebody's using a drill and bolting the bolts in place, they may not get them fully tight or over tighten them. And what happens is the wind starts to get a little bit of vibration on the solar panel, it flies off like a Frisbee. So it's thinking through those things as well. And so a lot of the lessons learned on these solar projects at scale has connected us to the CEOs of solar companies through the years. And so it's during these big disturbances like Hurricane Sandy in New York, where we created a nonprofit project called Power Rockaway's Resiliency, was tested there and then scaled up in Puerto Rico, nearly a decade later. Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, and the Coastal Marine Resource Center, where I volunteer my time on nights and weekends as executive director, we launched a few projects on the island, and also supported nonprofits smaller than us and larger than us, kind of a middle out approach to how do we move warehouses full of solar to the island quickly, because the federal government was not able to move at scale or at the speed that they did with Sandy in New York. We saw a big gap. My father lives there in Isabela, Puerto Rico on the northwest coast. So it kind of became our home base. And we tapped into our colleagues who were Neo-Ricans, Puerto Ricans settled in New York. And that image on the bottom left is our Lola studio would shut down at 5 p.m. And then at 6 p.m., all these fellow designers in the city would come and help volunteer their time to help Puerto Rico post Maria. So it became, the Mofongo studio. We're playing salsa really loud and eating Puerto Rican food and trying to find ways to help as fast as we could. And many people stepped up. We had, especially the arts community, we had Carol Walker and 𝘼𝙗𝙩𝙪, these amazing artists who stepped up and said, how can we help? And we just had a list of needs. And most of the CEOs of these solar companies said, hey, I've got a warehouse in Utah with 90 pallets and I'm paying rent on this thing. If you can come get it, it's yours, and I'll donate it to the nonprofit. I'll get a 30% tax reduction. It's a really good feedback loop. And then FedEx offered a jet for free. The pilot donated his time, and FedEx said, if you pay for the fuel, and then several organizations came together, including Hispanic Federation, and Lin-Manuel Miranda and his father, Luis Miranda, came through on paying for that fuel. And because of that big, confluence of energy, we're able to scale really quickly, get football fields of solar out on the ground. And the very first year was an emergency project where we're flying in solar experts from New York to quickly install solar panels. And then the second year, we converted from installations for the emergency and to realizing that there's not enough solar experts on the island. So we created a workforce development program called Solar Libre. So I'm going to wrap up here. This is, we'd get, artists and celebrities would call us and say, what can I do to help? And we'd say, come down here, we'll put you to work, spread the word, and let's scale this up. And that's 𝘼𝙗𝙗𝙪𝙩 on the left here, the artist Justin Bryce Boriglia. This is the Y receiver from the New York Giants, whose Puerto Rican roots are in Arecibo on the North Coast. So we're installing a disabled community center for folks with disabilities. And Y receiver is helping pass up some solar panels on the roof. And the Solar Libre program was funded by the Y receiver, Victor Cruz, Samsung Foundation. And we started to shift from doing installations to focusing on workforce development, and mostly for women. We found that only 1/5 of the island was solar industry was employing women, and we needed a just recovery with all hands on deck. So that last comment at the end, he was admiring that he doesn't hear the generator anymore. There was silence. So this was an orphanage in the mountains of Puerto Rico that we came across. And to keep in mind, the storm was September, October. This was December, right before Christmas. They didn't have power. And I just felt that our country is really letting down Puerto Rico, who is an American territory. And there shouldn't be that level of neglect in our policy. And we need to find ways for this not to happen. But this was our, we've done now near 180 sites like this. But this one was the most touching because I saw kids the age of my own son, neglected by our own government. And here, solar and battery got that Christmas tree light on that they optimistically decorated, anticipating the power would come on, of course, by Christmas. But thankfully, we were there and able to get them energized. But I just learned so much about them. And now I've stepped back from the program and hired all Puerto Ricans to run the Solar Libre program. It's run by women. And I just send resources their way. And they tell me, what they want to do with it. So, self-empowered and are really leading the recovery now and leading resilience thinking. A lot of the energy resiliency expertise in the future will come over the next 5 years from Puerto Rico, from Puerto Ricans. And so tonight I brought a guest, and I'm going to share the screen. I yield some of my time to, as I mentioned, we work with a lot of nonprofits, larger and smaller than us, but there's a lot of love between New York City and Puerto Rico. And another colleague of mine, his name is Hunter Johansen. Part of the arts community has really stepped up. Hunter Johansen has a background in performing arts, but studied at NYU in nonprofit policy and governance. And now he's the CEO of a great program that I want you guys to learn about called Solar Responders. He teamed up with firemen and he's been energizing firehouses all throughout Puerto Rico. So I'm gonna stop sharing and allow Hunter to present his work. And I want everyone to think about how the arts, landscape, and resiliency and climate change all converge around this topic, and that we need all hands on deck for this. Hunter, if your slides,
yeah,
I have the slides for backup.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Should I just share my screen?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. And let me know if the sound is okay, because I've had issues. Desktop.
And Hunter, like myself, shuttles back and forth between Puerto Rico and New York and the city. Just doing the same thing, just trying to help the island and empower them to recover on their own terms. Just kind of get out of their way, give them resources and let them make their decisions. And sometimes we need many NGOs working in this space to solve the problems until the government can respond. And it might be another year or two before the funds that have been released by this administration currently start hitting the ground on the island. So in the interim, it's the NGO space that's filling that gap. Go ahead, Hunter.
Took a landscaping degree, which I always wanted, never had. So thank you for that so much. I went to college and at the University of Vermont, studied environmental economics, and I had a number of friends that went into landscape and design and all that stuff. So I remember taking a class or two on it back in the day. So appreciate all you do. And in regards to I'm a native New Yorker. I was in New York when Hurricane Sandy happened, and am very familiar with the impact of the storm of Sandy in Rockaway specifically. The work that Walter is doing is extremely important in regards to protecting, doing everything they can for resiliency and for the residents, and protecting them from flooding. That strip of New York City had about a 15-foot storm surge. And it is probably the poorest area in the city per capita, and you have you can see the Manhattan skyline in the distance. So it's this really interesting juxtaposition. But when you're in Rockaway, looking out to the wealthiest city in the world, and you're surrounded by flooded houses and people, I'm talking a year after the hurricane, still, houses that are damaged, filled with mold and so on. So the work that Walter is doing is really awesome, and I'm just excited to talk to you guys about what we're doing here in Puerto Rico. So I'm currently in San Juan right now, and it's beautiful here right now. This is the best time of year to be here. Sorry for all those who are experiencing winter in the I guess everywhere around the country right now. I've been working on this mission for almost 3 years now. We're coming up, it's about 3.5 years since the hurricane hit Puerto Rico. For those who, I'm sure everybody here, this is not, this is knowledge that everybody knows about, but just to recap, there were an estimated over 3,000 deaths as a result of Hurricane Maria. Harvard has estimated it closer to 5,000. The US government has an official death count of, I believe, 57. And how we measure, how people lose their lives after a storm is very controversial. That being said, the destruction across the island was everywhere. Certain parts got hit worse than others. The storm entered in the southeast part of the island and traveled up, as Walter mentioned. It was about a Cat 5 near there. It was caused the most damage of any storm in U.S. history. And I'm just trying to move this. And it also was caused the longest power outage. So in different parts of the island, the power in the metro area, where I'm in San Juan right now in the capital, power was maybe lost for a couple of weeks. As you disperse out to other parts of the island, especially the interior, that there were communities without power of 6 months, 8 months. Culebra, which is, for those who know Puerto Rico, it's an island off of the coast of Puerto Rico, population of about 2,000. That island was disconnected from the power grid for over a year. And they were receiving shipments of diesel from FEMA for over a year during that period. So the grid is very fragile, especially as you leave the metro area. I think Walter kind of covered this, and this is kind of general knowledge. Storms are increasing in intensity and in number. Last hurricane season was the most active storm season on record. I was in Puerto Rico the entire year last year during COVID. And there's this kind of, it's not a new phenomenon. It was a new phenomenon for me. I've never been in an earthquake before, but their earthquake started on January 6th. The island was hit with a 6.2 and then a 6.2 and then a 6.0 a few hours after. That damaged a few hundred buildings on the southwest part of the island and knocked out power for a number of weeks to that part of the island. And also a major power plant that serves that area. So there's a number of different phenomena that Puerto Rico faces: flooding, earthquakes, storms, and federal agencies are they're basically focused on short-term relief, and they're not even really good at that. FEMA was very late to arrive, just as they were in Sandy. It took a couple of days for the National Guard to show up. It was very cold out in New York. You can imagine if the response is not great in New York, then it's much worse in a place like Puerto Rico. The Jones Act is a federal law that requires ships coming to Puerto Rico. The actual ships are U.S. made ships and operated ships. It's like 100-year-old law. It took the Trump administration a long time to give a reprieve and stop the Jones Act. He stopped it for, I think, for 10 days and allowed non-made U.S. ships to deliver aid. How we respond to disasters is we react to them. We're not planning ahead of time. We're not proactive, and all the work that Walter does is related to proactive measures and looking in the long term. So we rely on diesel generators and other investments that are above ground lines that are for the distribution of power that are not resilient, and also the Stafford Act. So for us, we're a 501c3 nonprofit in the U.S. We're an 11-1 tax exempt organization here in Puerto Rico. Much of the federal money that is coming to Puerto Rico and in general to after a disaster cannot be by law used for new resiliency measures. You have to rebuild what existed and what was destroyed by a storm. So there's, we're going up against the grain. There's just not a lot of opportunity for new innovative measures to take place using federal government dollars. And so we have not received any government money. It's for our mission. So what we do, and I got introduced to the fire department here 4 months after the hurricane. And when I was interested, I was studying nonprofit management at NYU at the time. I was in my last semester. I was interested in seeing how I could support the efforts in Puerto Rico, based on my experience in New York, and growing up in New York and having just a true love for Puerto Ricans, the culture. I flew down with a firefighter friend of mine he's actually from Las Vegas. He's a captain there, and discovered that all the fire stations across the island were without power. There's 96 of them. So we were really responding to what the fire department needed, which was reliable power. There's not many resources for maintenance of diesel generators. So many of the diesel generators supplying power to this island, supplying power to the fire stations were broken before, or eventually they broke down because days, weeks use of a generator 24/7, they're going to break down. It's also very difficult to transport fuel. So we came up with this idea of installing solar and batteries to power stations. We met with government officials. I spent the first year traveling back and forth. This was 2019. I spent the first year traveling back and forth between Puerto Rico and New York, meeting government officials, nonprofits, solar industry experts, local installers, firefighters around the island, understanding their needs and their stories, and started fundraising, built a 501c3, raised some money. We focus our installations on fire stations that serve communities that received power the last. There's a really interesting video from NASA by actually a Boricua scientist that shows where power came on the last and where the grid is the most weak. And so that's where we focus our energy, our installations. And the impact is that in the 6 months, in the first 6 months, firefighters have power. So we're about 15 weeks away from the hurricane season, June 1st, from the Atlantic hurricane season. So they have immediate power. If the grid shuts down, which it does often, they have access to power. They can charge radios, computers, the 911 system works. Longer term, there's environmental impact. We are reducing energy bills by anywhere from about 15 to 50%, depending on the size of the system. Increases local preparedness, not having to rely on FEMA and other federal institutions that arrive much later. It's a safe haven for community residents, and we're also, just as Walter is doing, we're looking to partner with local organizations to provide training and employment opportunities. We hire locally, so our installation companies are local, our engineers are all local. And I can show, I got a couple of pictures. So these are just some, can you still see? Good, all right. So this is just some of our systems. This is in Rincon. This is pretty close to Mayaguez and Isabela, where Walter's father's from. So initially, when we first came to the island, this was our first station. We were powering, our systems were a bit smaller. Obviously, these systems can cost anywhere from $60,000 to $120,000. So, you know, our abilities are due to fundraising. Culebra is the island that I mentioned, which was out of power for about a year. This is our second station. 𝘼𝙗𝙩𝙪𝙪 is the center of the earthquakes that occurred in January. And this area continues to lose power all the time. Humacao this is where the Hurricane Maria entered the island. It's in the southeast portion. This is the district fire station, so that they serve about 60,000 people. In the lower part of the bottom picture is a picture of the fire chief, the lieutenant, and our local installation team on the right. Luisa is an Afro-Puerto Rican community, about 30,000 residents. Traditionally kind of not served well, as well as other communities. They've been left out of numerous public policies over the years. 𝘼𝙗𝙩𝙪𝙪 is right across from Old San Juan. This area was flooded, and this was the last station we completed just last week. We're doing a press conference next week. Really excited about it. And then I'll just show you a quick video, and then I'll be finished.
We can't decide when we're gonna need a first responder to come save our lives. Those seconds and minutes after an emergency are the most critical time, that time between life and death. Hurricane Maria proved how fragile the grid is here. This station was without power for 6 months after Hurricane Maria. We work in partnership with the Puerto Rico Fire Department to install solar power and battery storage to ensure that first responders have reliable backup power so that when the grid fails, which it does often, they have no gaps in service. Power is essential for them to do their jobs. We just need your help, so firefighters will be able to continue to save lives throughout the hurricane season.
So an important question, first one right off the bat, really important topic. Amelia Lindy asks, she would like to know the energy of anti-colonialism in your work and practice, and how is anti-colonialism manifested in your process, and how does this support climate resilience design? This is, if you're going to work in places like Puerto Rico, it's one of the last colonies on the planet, when most of the, colonists, the European and the definition, conventional definition of the term, have started to decolonize their territories. Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States, right? It's in many ways, it has some autonomy, but it also is suffering from a lot of burdens in that it contributes so much to the United States in terms of tax base and gets so little in return. Puerto Rico contributes, on the level of the top tier of the 50 states in terms of contribution to the federal tax coffers, but gets much less in return than what happens in West Virginia or, Mississippi, some of the most impoverished states in the US. And working in decolonizing is something we talk about in our office, not just working in Puerto Rico, literally decolonizing, but also working in our own work, working in environmental justice space, making sure that, we're not being the saviors, that we're not just being activists. An activist is someone who says, look at me, I'm saving the world with my design. An organizer is very different than an activist. An organizer isn't about concentration of power, it's about conveying power of the community, right? And so these abstract thoughts hit the ground on how we implement projects. And so, knowing when to step in your power and when to step out is an important thing to be able to do. And so, that work is in every community we work in. And it's the name of our firm. Local office is literally empowering the locals, are the experts of their community and of their place. And so our job, as we feel as a catalyst, to not just listen, but to process information and make sure that their ideas are not just heard, but are actionable part of the design process. So when we're doing community outreach, it's probably the most important thing is synthesizing the information we're getting from the community and what we call ethnographic research, going in and hearing the lived experience, the lived experience of the constituents and the residents and citizens of the projects that we work in. So thank you for that answer, that question. I'm going to open up another question here. Chat.
Sure.
Walter, I think the next question was from Emily O'Mahony. She said, thank you. How do you present yourself as a landscape architect? How do you present yourself as a landscape architect or an urban designer or other?
Yeah. So, I mean, I make cities for the most part, right? City maker, but you can call it urban design. That was my last degree, was urban design. But that, if you look at a Venn diagram of urbanism at the center, there's all these other things that come into it, right? There's architecture and urbanism, which is the firm that I worked at before, Cooper Robertson. And then there's firms like mine, which is landscape and urban design. You know, so there's different types of urbanism. But, you know, first and foremost, I'm educated as both a landscape and an urban designer with 2 degrees. But, and I design cities and infrastructure, and, you know, landscape thinking is at the core of this. And I'm certainly a plantsman. I was raised in a family of tree farmers, native trees down in the Redlands in the southeast of Florida near Miami, and also in the Florida Keys. So, you know, our family had islands down the Keys that we would take boats out to and live on parts of my life. And so, you know, learning to live with the sea is really core to that. And so, I mean, you know, I could be called a horticulturalist, a landscape contractor, a lot of things, but truly landscape thinking is at the core of my decision-making process.
Najla says, mosquitoes are a big issue here in Florida. Can you elaborate on the approach and plants used to mitigate it?
Yeah, so it's not, there's no single solution. Really a healthy ecosystem doesn't have an abundance of one species or another. And so what I was discussing for Mayaguez is a multi-layered management there. There's active management of the mosquito problem. If you just planted the wetland and didn't maintain it, you would have a mosquito problem. But you know, there's several species. It's easy to research. If you look at the Muir web, M-U-I-R, you know, every fauna, every species of animal is entangled with a bunch of plants that it depends on. There's this interconnectedness between plants and animals. And so if you were to select in the Muir web the dragonfly, which eats mosquitoes, right? It's connected to at least 7 different species of plants that you can establish as a plant community to attract the dragonfly. And that's just one, but then you start hitting them all. There's bats, right? So there's a lot of threatened and endangered species of bats in Florida that we need to be supporting. And they also, if we provide habitat vis-a-vis bat houses, one of the largest bat houses in the nation is on University of Florida's campus in Gainesville. I hope it's still there near the lake. Is that still there, Dan?
Yes.
Yeah, we need a bat house in every town, right? Or every sector of every town. So bats eat tons of mosquitoes, right? And there's that correlation there. There's a lot of native fish species to Florida and the Caribbean that eat mosquito larvae, and making sure you're inoculating ponds and lakes and wetland areas with these species. Furthermore, making sure that you can use beneficial bacteria, Bacillus BT cakes, they call them, can be distributed monthly into water bodies, and that eats the larvae of the mosquito before they're able to mature and fly away. So it's that multi-layered response. You've got your aerial species, then you got your benthic species all working together to manage the problem. And it's probably still not enough on a landscape scale, but in terms of cities, the landscapes are small enough that you can start to manage them. But at the regional scale, it becomes managing the habitat so it can balance itself. But it's the imbalance that is the issue, too much resource extraction for the population of people.
Great, thank you. And we have, I think, we got 1 minute, time for one last question from Thomas, who says, how hopeful are you that we can close the gap between scientific, educational knowledge and policy change? I think that's a good question, Nick.
That's been the focus of many of my colleagues, has been compressing the time required from academic thought to shaping policy. And sometimes it's, you know, like a lot of my professors at Harvard were hired by the Obama administration. And that sped things up. I saw things that normally took 20, 30 years to migrate into mainstream policy were happening in less than a decade. And, you know, things that were seen as, you know, ecologically extreme are now becoming the norm in this administration. You know, things that the Obama administration didn't want to touch a little too much. Now it's just like, let's just go for it. We're going to fight climate change. We're not going to, you know, we're not going to supplement the problem. We're going to come in and fight it directly and change our entire economy around this, right? So it's an exciting time. The time is compressing from what used to be 30 years down to less than a decade. The other way we can affect policy is to affect media and affect culture, right? And the case that you see with Puerto Rico and why I asked Hunter to join is how much it's not about the designers and planners or the policymakers in a singular way. It's culture. Hunter's a part of a network of culture makers who are contributing their resources to help a really unfortunate situation in Puerto Rico. That is still a long-term problem, and there's still emergencies happening as a result of a policy of neglect in previous administrations.
Can I add something there?
Yeah, go ahead.
You know, while I do feel that philanthropy and celebrities and you know, very wealthy people have abilities to make change, you know, it is not. I don't think that it's not a sustainable route, and it's not something we can rely on. And it can bring attention towards an issue. But I do feel like it lets off the hook the real decision makers, the elected officials, the people that we expect to get things done. I do think that it is a collective responsibility to address these issues. But I do want to say that it's fleeting, and that you know, that when there's an intention, we're not built to maintain so much information. Our attention leaves, you know, 6 months after an issue, if not less, you know, a month after an issue. Now it's less. So, you know, while I love the opportunities that well-known people can provide to an issue, it's not a model that I think we should continue to expect, you know, change to come from. I think we need to really continue to work with government officials, academia, private sector, especially corporations, to work these issues out.
Thank you, Hunter.
All right. Well, thank you, Walter. Hunter, thank you for joining us as well. And thank you all for participating in this year's Edward D. Stone Jr. lecture series. We really appreciate it. It was a wonderful presentation, and we look forward to hosting this again next year. Thanks again. You all have a good night.